It's a great pleasure to be here again. It's also a great pleasure to try and deal with an issue that's one of the trickiest things in clinical care and indeed in social life generally. How do you link an adverse event to a treatment? And in particular, an adverse event like violence. It's, as you'll see, the trickiest thing of all to link to a treatment. But it's an issue that's got huge implications for all of us. Let me just begin here with the issue of adverse events in general, drug-induced adverse events. And this is the thalidomide crisis. You have a child here, the advert says that your young child's life could be saved if you switched from a barbiturate sleeping pill over to the new sleeping pill, thalidomide, because if you overdose on it, if your child finds this pill, opens the top of the bottle and takes all the pills, overdoses on it, that they aren't going to be killed by it. But of course, as we know, this was a drug that produced horrific side effects. And in an effort to try and make sure that that wouldn't happen again, we put controls in place, which you might think are the kinds of controls that help us pick up the adverse effects of drugs, but in fact are controls that do just the opposite. They hide the adverse effects of drugs. What we put in place are controlled trials. Okay? The idea was to get the pharmaceutical companies to produce new pills to prove that their drugs worked and were safe before they were brought to the market. But controlled trials have a number of adverse events. Controlled trials were all about trying to get the pharmaceutical companies to bring drugs on the market to prove the drugs worked. They were going to be forced, as it were, to squeeze through the eye of a needle before they could get on the market. The idea was industry were a bunch of scurvy knaves who couldn't be trusted, and controlled trials was a way to help us dance with the industry python. Now, there are actually parts of the world where people dance with pythons. Men organize for women to dance with the pythons rather than actually dance with them themselves. And here you see a lady from Malaysia dancing with a python. She's a lady who made a mistake later on, because this can go wrong, this particular dance, if the python can grip its tail onto a fixed point. If it can do that, it can squeeze you to death. The art lies in ensuring that the python can't get a grip of anything firm. When we put control trials in place, we thought we were grappling with industry, but in fact, industry have been awfully pleased with the whole thing, because what they found is they can do control trials and hide all the data that comes out of these control trials, and that's the point at which they grip their tail onto a fixed point and are squeezing us all to death, because they hide the data from the adverse events that their drug may have caused in the course of a control trial. There's a further problem. The whole ethos or method behind controlled trials assumes that the observations of the individual person can't be relied upon. So we're now in a world where the observations of the person over on the right, the pilot of a near miss, are taken into account and paid heed to. If she reports that things nearly went wrong when I tried to take off on the plane on a plane flight from wherever to wherever, people pay heed and they change the system in order to make sure that these things don't happen again. But the observations of the person on the left, if she puts you on a drug and reports that this has made you become violent and hostile and possibly try to kill people, her observations aren't paid heed to. They're binned. They're regarded as anecdotes, because only clinical trials give us decent information. Her observations don't change the system at all. Okay, and that's one of the adverse effects we have from controlled trials. There's a further problem. We're in a world where the regulators and companies are very, very slow to ever say a drug has caused any problem at all. In the case of thalidomide, far from conceding that the drug caused children to be born armless and limbless, the regulatory response was, well, we don't know for sure that this drug hasn't prevented spontaneous miscarriages. It could have been that these children were going to be born anyway, or were going to have no arms and legs anyway, but wouldn't have been born because they'd have been miscarried. But this drug has prevented the spontaneous miscarriage, so now they're born, in which case the drug wouldn't have caused their armlessness and leglessness. This isn't just an argument from 1962. This drug remains on the market today in many different countries worldwide, it and variants of it. This is a photograph that's not from 1962. This is Brazil 10 years ago, where over 1,000 children have been born armless and limbless on this drug. So it's not an old and past tense issue. It's also not a response that's unique to this drug. Let me introduce you to Matt Miller. Matt Miller was a 13-year-old boy who had just changed schools. Clearly, when you go to a new school at this age, you can be a little bit nervous for a while. And during the first few weeks in his new school, he was nervous, and his teacher told his parents that he was a bit nervous and anxious. Perhaps they should bring him to a doctor. The doctor put Matt on one of the SSRIs, Zoloft. And a week after he went on this, he went into the bathroom between his parents' bedroom and his bedroom and hung himself. Frequently, when you hang yourself on drugs like the SSRIs, you're not absolutely certain you're going to kill yourself. You're toying with the idea. And one of the things you'll do is you put a noose around your neck and press against it. And if you do that, you can accidentally press on the carotid bodies, which cause you to lose consciousness, to slip forward and hang yourself. So a lot of people who hang themselves on SSRI drugs hang themselves kneeling, which led to the response from the company that made this drug and regulators was, well, we don't know that this isn't autoerotic asphyxiation gone wrong in a 13-year-old boy. We're not going to conclude that the drug has caused him to commit suicide. This is routine regulatory and company responses to these issues. If you're waiting for the MHRA in this country, the FDA over in the States, to ever say a drug has caused a problem, you will be waiting a long time. It's not in their DNA. And there's a further problem. Now, this could be any adverse effect at all. This is an email from a woman 12 years ago to GSK. She's been put on their SSRI, Paxil, and it's been hugely helpful for her. She's less anxious on it. Could you wait till the end and we'll pick it up at the end? Okay. Hopefully you can read this, but I'll leave all of the actual slides here so you'll be able to see them later. But what she's saying to the company is this. Your pill was hugely helpful for me. Problem I have is I got pregnant and my baby had truncus arteriosus. This is a defect of the blood vessels leading out from the heart. And she wants to know, look, could your drug have caused this? Because both I and my husband are desperately keen to have a family. And even though your drug has helped me hugely, if the drug could have caused a problem, I will go off it in order to make sure that my next baby has a better chance. Okay, so here's the end of the email here. I'm not saying anything bad about your drug. It's been a miracle pill for me. I just need to know if there's any evidence that the drug could have caused the problem. The response from the company, this could have been the same if you'd got in touch with them trying to say, look, could your drug have caused me to become violent and kill my children or whatever? The response would have been the same, which is they're directing her to the product information sheet for the drug, and they wanted to go back to her doctor, who at the time was being told actively by GSK that their drug is the best drug to give to women of childbearing years, that there's no risk that it could cause any birth defects at all, just as they would have said there's no risk that it could cause you to become violent or whatever. And go to your doctor. This is the key point, because he supposedly or she supposedly knows all about you. The company doesn't want to give advice because they don't know you. So whether this gets through to her or not, I'm not sure. But she gets in touch with them the next day and says, look, I really need to know, is there any research going on about your drug and birth defects of the type that my child had. I need to know, because if there is any hints that I shouldn't be on this drug, even though it's going to cause me awful problems to halt it, I will halt it. Now, one of the extraordinary things about this is that she was able to get through to GSK at all, because it's terribly, terribly hard to get through to any of the pharmaceutical companies on these issues. Over in the States, they've got direct-to-consumer adverts for all their drugs. And these adverts come with a phone number on the bottom of it that links to a call center, usually in India these days. It isn't a place that's going to give you any information about whether the drug could have caused the problem or not. Adverts to people like me in journals also have phone numbers on them. And again, they don't link to GSK. GSK has a range of numbers you can call, none of which link to the medical information department at all. Nothing links to anyone who has any duty to really let you know could their drug cause the problem or not. These days, GSK will do a thing that they didn't do back then, which is they'll divert this particular woman or you to report to MHRA or FDA over in the States. And this sounds good, I'm sure, to all of you, which is, don't report to us, the company. We've got a vested interest. Report to the regulator. But in fact, the company has a legal duty to follow you up if problems go wrong on a pill. FDA don't. So when they divert your reports to FDA, what they're doing is they're reducing their costs, they're reducing their legal liability, and they're reducing the status of your report to an anecdote. If they follow you up, it may become an awful lot clearer that actually the drug did cause the problem. They have a duty to follow you up, as I said, and the lady got through to GSK, so they followed her up. Here's a note that went out to her. It didn't actually get to her, we know that. One of the tricky problems she had was she lived in a terribly Christian community over in the States, one where it would not have been a good idea to have a termination. Raising the issue at all for her must have been a terribly tricky problem. Having a termination must have been a terribly tricky problem. This note from GSK will have been all about trying to get in touch with her OBGYN in order to find out could there have been any other reason that could have caused the birth defect that her baby had. It's not really about trying to find out did their drug cause the problem or not. But the note didn't get to her. Now, I said to you that they've got a duty, nevertheless, to work out did their drug cause a problem. And this could have been you if you'd been put on their drug and murdered your children or your best friend or whatever. They'll have to, if they get a report, they have to determine if their drug's unrelated to the problem or not, or unlikely to be linked to the problem or not, or whether it's possible that it could be linked, or probable that it could be linked, or almost certain that it was linked. In this lady's case, they decided it was almost certain that the drug had caused the problem. In your case, they could have decided that it was almost certain that their SSRI caused you to murder your children, but they wouldn't tell you. In public, they will say there is no evidence that our drug causes birth defects, even though this drug is now known to cause birth defects. Not just her birth defects, but birth defects in general. And equally, they would say there's no evidence that our drug causes people to become violent. And that's true for all companies. It's not just a GSK issue. If you're a doctor, you have no rights to find out what the data shows. If you're a patient, you've got no rights to find out what the data shows. If you're an investor in the company, however, according to the Supreme Court of the United States 2 years ago, you have a right to see what the data shows, which is a curious little anomaly. Just to come back, one more point before we get into the meat of the issues that have us, or have me here at least, which is we put control trials in place to try and make sure problems like this couldn't happen again. We put them in place in 1962. As of 1962, there had only been one drug that had been through a placebo-controlled trial before it had been brought on the market. And in this placebo-controlled trial, it had been shown to be safe and efficacious. And this drug was thalidomide. The drug that causes the problem sailed right through the system that we've put in place to try and reduce the risks of this kind of thing happening again. Right, when it comes to violence, there's a few other issues, and this isn't a thing that actually applies here just yet, but if you're over in a university in the United States and you're either staff or students or anyone else working in the university, these days you're involved in homeland security type apparatus. Because of the school shootings that happen over in the States, beginning with the Columbine shooting, but particularly picking up speed with the Virginia Tech shooting, an apparatus has been put in place which is the same as the Homeland Security apparatus. There's an industry that's grown up, $1 billion industry, which is all about screening students for the risks that they may pose. The person who's put these issues on the map most clearly is over there on the far right. It's a woman called Rachel Liebert. And she did so in part because when she was recruited to a post in New York and induced, the first thing they were told was, as staff here in the university, if you guys see any student behaving in any way odd, you have a duty, just as in the Homeland Security type situation, that if you see something, say something. If you see any oddity, you have to tell the powers that be all about the student that you've just witnessed being odd. And there's as you see from here, there's security forces being put in place in various colleges and schools and things like that. Seeing oddities is going to lead to an awful lot more students being put on medicines of the kind that I'm going to talk about now. And of course, if these drugs cause people to be odd or behave strangely or become violent, we're putting an apparatus in place which is increasing the risks that the very thing we're trying to prevent is going to happen again. In the instances that you're going to see, there's one more issue that you need to take into account, which is this. You're going to see a few cases of husbands murdering wives. In terms of trying to judge what's going on and have the pills played a role, you've got to take into account that the commonest detected murder is a husband murdering his wife. The commonest murder is probably a wife murdering her husband, but she's much too clever to be detected. And finally, one more thing to take into account is this, that the factors that cause people to become violent on drugs are exactly the same factors that cause people to become suicidal on drugs. These drugs come with black box warnings that they cause you to commit suicide. If that's the case, they also cause you to commit violence. I'm raising the issue here because for those of you who, well, you may know that one of the first people that we know about that was possibly induced to commit suicide by the antidepressant she was put on a week before was Sylvia Plath. What are the mechanisms that lead drugs to cause people to commit suicide? Well, it's going to be the same bunch of mechanisms that will lead you to commit violence. And among them, there's a condition called akathisia. This is an odd Greek word that's not terribly user-friendly. It basically, in this context, means mental turmoil. That you can go on a drug that's the wrong drug for you, and it can lead you to be tense and restless and have strange and unusual thoughts. These quotes are all from people put on a drug called reserpine. They were put on it for hypertension. They had no nervous problems, they weren't anxious, they weren't depressed, no mental illness. They were normal people put on the drug, and a few hours later they become restless with unusual impulses of harming themselves or harming others. The next thing that can cause people to become violent is this. This is well recognized by the lay public generally, but not by academia or regulators. This is a Charlie Brown cartoon, as you see here, and this is from about 15 years ago or more. Lucy has pinched the ball from Charlie Brown, and Charlie Brown has an unusual response. This is not the response Lucy's looking for. Okay? He wanders off, and she's very disappointed. Lucy, however, 15 years ago or more, knew exactly what was wrong with Charlie Brown, leading him to behave in this strange and unusual way for him. Charlie Brown was on Prozac, and it had caused an emotional numbing. Okay? It can also cause disinhibition. You lose your anxieties about things, and you contemplate and do things that you wouldn't in the ordinary course of events contemplate and do. And the third thing, although there are more, the third big thing that these drugs can do to cause you to commit suicide or to become violent is you can hallucinate on them, for instance. You can hear the voice of God telling me to kill David over here. Well, even though he's a good friend, if it's the voice of God telling me to kill him, I've got no option. That's what I'll do. Okay? Right. The violence story on the SSRI group of drugs, but I'm going to broaden it out beyond this group of drugs before the end, began in 1989 when a man called Joseph Westbecker went into his place of work with several AK-47s, having been put on Prozac 4 weeks previously and having had a prior adverse response to Prozac, and killed 8 people, seriously injured 12 others before killing himself. A jury were asked to look at the issues 5 years later and concluded it seemed that the Prozac hadn't caused the problem. In fact, the company had settled out of court, and the judge was furious and got the verdict changed and said this case was resolved, with the implication that the company at least thought there was good evidence that the drug had caused the problem. But let's skip 12 years forward from there to this case here, which is the case of Donald Schell, a tough, hard-bitten oil worker who had had a few episodes of being anxious during his life. One of them had occurred in 1984. These things lasted 2 or 3 weeks. He had a spell of being out of sorts and nervous. 1990, Prozac has just come out. He has a further episode of being anxious, goes to his GP who says, look, there's this miracle new drug out called Prozac. This is bound to put you right. On the drug, where before the episodes have cleared up quickly within 2 to 3 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks later, he is much worse. He is hearing voices. The GP stops the pills and says, look, these just don't suit him, okay? 8 years later, he goes back to the GP, a different GP who isn't aware of his adverse response to Prozac. And this GP says he's anxious and he's not sleeping. They don't even say that he's depressed. They put him on another SSRI, one of the Prozac group of drugs, in this case, Paxil. And 48 hours later, Don Schell, whom you see on the left, puts 3 bullets through the head of his wife, whom you see beside him, 3 bullets through the head of his daughter, whom you see 2 over, and 3 bullets through the head of his granddaughter, who's in his daughter's hands there, before killing himself. A jury in Cheyenne, Wyoming, listened to the case taken by his son-in-law, Tim Tobin, whom you see on the far right, and conclude Paxil caused Donald Schell to kill these people and kill himself. Cheyenne, Wyoming is a tough part of the country. This is a little bit out of date, this joke, but the usual joke from the area was it's very tough and conservative. It's a state with 500,000 conservative voters and 1 liberal politician, Dick Cheney. In the same week that verdict came in, David Hawkins in Sydney, Australia, was also on trial. David Hawkins had a history of being anxious, never any episodes have been in any way violent, 50 years actually married to the same woman. They got on well. He'd Some years beforehand, he'd been put on one of these new SSRIs, Zoloft. He'd had a very bad response to it, and his doctor had noted, never give him this drug again. Many years later, he had a further episode of nerves, goes back to the doctor who's on holidays. There's a locum there who doesn't read the medical notes and says, I have just the drug for you, I'm going to put you on Zoloft. He puts him on Zoloft. David Hawkins doesn't realize this is the same drug that he was on years before that he had the bad response to. Takes a pill and a few hours later feels much worse and thinks, well, if I have a few more pills, maybe that'll help me. So has 4 more pills, spends the night up restlessly wandering around the house. The next morning his wife comes down to breakfast and he kills her. He heads off to try and kill himself, but the police intervene and he's put in jail and his case goes to court. And when they look at the evidence, the judge and the prosecutor, in addition to the defense, say the Zoloft caused this. But for the fact that he was on this SSRI, he would not have killed his wife. Marilee Bentley was also from Australia, and she was a 32-year-old woman who was the mother of 2. She had a history of being anxious, and her doctor had tried one of the SSRIs, Paxil in this case, and this had made her worse. So he switched her to a different pill, Effexor, and that also didn't seem to help, so he put the dose up and up and up. And every step of the way, as the dose went up, she got worse and worse and worse. And on a very high dose, she then took her 2 children out to drive in the car with her. They stopped by a lake. She fixed a hose pipe onto the exhaust of the car and fed it into the window and sat there with the engine going. And after a period of time, the kids said, look, Mum, we're feeling itchy. Why? And why are we stopped here and not doing anything? So after a period of time, she decided this really wasn't working, so she took the hose pipe out again and drove on a few miles and stopped and tried it again. And finally concluded this just wasn't working. She didn't realize that she had a car that had a catalytic converter on it, and she didn't know that when you have these on your car that you cannot use a hose pipe to kill yourself. So she turned herself into the police, who charged her with attempted murder. But again, when the judge got to look at all the reports, when the court got to consider the issues, they decided if she hadn't been on this drug, particularly as now that she'd halted all these drugs, she was in a completely different frame of mind. They decided that now that that if she hadn't been on these drugs, she wouldn't have behaved the way she did, so she walked free, just as David Hawkins did. This is a case that had a different outcome. For those of you who've seen the movie Side Effects, it's about a woman who goes on this new pill, and she and her lover have worked out that she can feign sleepwalking on the pill and kill her husband, and it'll be good for all of them. So she does, but just so I don't spoil what actually happens for those of you who haven't seen the movie yet, things don't work out quite the way it's actually expected. She does get off, though, in the first instance, because walking in your sleep and committing murder is an absolute defense against murder. If you kill your partner while you're walking in your sleep, you should walk free. In this case, however, MC didn't walk free. MC was a man who was taking cocaine. In order to control his cocaine habit, his GP put him on an SSRI, Paxil. That's Seroxat here in the UK. And because that made him agitated and he couldn't sleep in it, the GP gave him a sleeping pill. Now, SSRIs can cause alcoholism. People who haven't been alcoholic before, who go on an SSRI, can start to drink heavily. And this led to arguments with his wife, and she threw him out and he went and lived with his parents. But every so often he used to come back and stay with her because they got on reasonably well. And this particular day, he was due to stay with her. They went out to the pub for a drink, and they came back and had an argument, and she said, look, you know, you're not going to sleep with me, you're going to have to stay on the sofa downstairs. So he stays on the sofa downstairs, has his pills, etc., etc. Next thing anyone knows is he's walked into the police station and he's holding the baby. They have a baby. He's holding their baby in his arms, and he's covered in blood. So the police go and look at what's happened, and it turns out that he's killed his wife. He's butchered her. Partner, not wife. Butchered her. Now, the two pills he's on are the top two on the list there on the left. Even though he's on these two pills, and there's evidence that since he went on them that he's walking in his sleep, and evidence that he never walked in his sleep beforehand, the court finds him guilty, and he's now in jail. So in his case, the fact that he walked in his sleep, probably triggered by these pills, didn't work. Didn't work in this case either. Lesley Demoniac was a 31-year-old woman who had twin boys. She broke up with her partner. It was an acrimonious breakup. This made her nervous and anxious, and reading a newspaper over in the States where they have adverts to consumers in the street, she noted this advert which said, if you're feeling anxious and nervous and intensely anxious at times, you might be having panic attacks. We have just the pill for you. So she clutched the newspaper and went along to her local doctor, where she saw the nurse, not the doctor, who gave her Zoloft. A month later, she'd gone back to the nurse once and said, look, on these pills I feel worse. I'm beginning to drink much more than I ever did before. I'm beginning to have thoughts about killing myself. And the nurse said, keep on with the pills, these take a while to work. So she kept on with them for 2 weeks more, went back again and said, look, these pills have made me feel much worse. So the nurse said, fine, we'll change them. She changed her from one SSRI to a different SSRI, from Zoloft to Paxil. And 48 hours after the change, Lesley put bullets to the head of each of her twin boys and then overdosed heavily herself. She clearly didn't expect to wake up. She did wake up. The police found her and charged her with murder, and she went to jail. Here's a further UK case. This man here, David Rule, was 50 years married to the woman on the left. The woman on the right's his daughter. It was a very close-knit family. He had no history of nerves of any sort whatsoever. He gets an episode of being anxious. His GP puts him on an SSRI, citalopram. 10 days later, having kept a diary during the time he was on it, a diary which shows his descent into madness on this pill, how he's becoming more agitated the whole time, how he's having thoughts about killing himself or doing strange and unusual things, or ending up in the mental hospital, being witnessed by his friends changing before their eyes into a completely different person. He kills his wife, batters her to death. He gets brought to prison. The drug gets halted. He's a changed man completely. This is the clearest case I have ever seen of the drugs causing a person to harm someone else. And I write a report to that effect. His lawyers, however, bottle it. They advise him to plea bargain. You'll only get 2 years in jail. Why? I mean, there's a risk that you might go down forever if you try to fight the case. 2 years in jail may sound reasonable to most of you. It may not sound too bad, but whereas the community from which he came was totally behind him before the trial, once he got convicted and was found guilty and put in jail for 2 years, he comes out 2 years later in the small community in which he lives, and he was a member of the cricket club and the bowling club and this, that, and the other club. No one will speak to him. The only person in the town that will speak to him are the girls working the checkout desks at the local supermarket. This man remains in jail even though he's come out. The question of whether he should have been found guilty or innocent is not an immaterial question. This is the key case. This is the Pittman case, and Christopher Pittman's on the right there, the little fella holding the fish, and that's his grandfather on the left. Christopher Pittman's 12 when the key events happen, which is he loves living with his grandparents more than with his father. The grandparents live in South Carolina, the father lives in Florida. He has an argument with his father and runs away to the grandparents' house. En route from the father's house to the grandparents' house, he gets picked up by the police, who bring him to a child mental health unit where they look at him and interview him and things like that and decide he's got no nervous problems at all, no mental health problems, but they put him on an SSRI anyway, just to be safe. The grandparents come to the unit and say, we're happy to have him home in our house. They bring him back to their house, and he continues with an SSRI. Now, he's lived with the grandparents a lot, gone to school there, gone to church there, done a bunch of things with them there previously. So he now goes back to school in the local school there and goes to church with the grandparents there. In school, whereas before he'd been extremely popular, now he's having fights the whole time with the other kids, to the point where there's a risk of him being banned from school. In church, he can't keep still. He kicks the desk in front, causing awful noise, and the grandparents are there saying, look, if you behave like this, we're going to have to send you back to your father. He's restless, he's agitated on this drug. So when he's told that he has to go, that he might have to go back to his father's house, things go wrong. And that night, it's unclear quite what happens, whether he hears a voice that says to him, kill them or whatever. He gets a gun, he gets the grandfather's gun and kills both the grandparents and burns the house down. So a jury listening to the case, and it's a case that runs in the media here under the headline that you see there. That's Christopher 3 years later, at the age of 15, so he's a lot bigger now. But there's the tissues on the bench in court just in front of him. The jury decide it's very clear the drug has changed his behavior. It's caused a problem. But they also find him guilty. The trouble is, South Carolina law is terribly strict. They don't let people off for anything. You're guilty if you've killed the person, you're guilty. So the judge is faced with a real problem, and here's the judge looking at the issues saying, he's the one who's going to have to sentence Christopher Pittman, and he can't really give this 15-year-old boy anything less than 30 years in prison, he figures. And he doesn't, he feels it's all wrong that he has to do that. He can't quite work out what's wrong, but it seems to him must be a legal issue. Okay? What's wrong is this, that Christopher Pittman has essentially the same kind of problem as a drug-induced sleepwalking. He's got a thing called a non-insane automatism. That is, when a drug or an event or a change in you produces a change in your behavior that you can't be expected to control, such as when you're walking in your sleep. You cannot form an intent to commit murder or to commit suicide in the usual way that people might form an intent to commit murder. Okay? In the same way, under the influence of the pills, I would argue, you've got the same kind of situation. This was recognized very well 350 years ago by Lord Chief Justice Matthew Hale, who wrote the key book on these issues, which is this one, which is the history of the pleas to the Crown. And I'm going to show you what Hale wrote. And up above there, you've got the actual text from the book, and I've translated it in two ways down below. It's the curious look up at that if a person, by the unskillfulness, so the S's that they had back then looked more like our F's today. So they're all changed to S's down here below, and I've changed one word. look at the bottom but one line halfway across, there's the word frenzy. Instead of that, I put in the word delirium, which is the modern word. And if you read this now, you'll see it makes complete sense. Most people will agree that if you're delirious, you're not responsible for your behavior. If a drug has caused you to be delirious, you're not responsible for your behavior. It's even worse if a drug has caused awful problems and it's a prescription-only drug, and you come back and complain to your doctor, look, this drug makes you feel bad or worse, and he has said, couldn't be the drug, double the dose, which happens with prescription drugs a lot. So the original insanity defense is a delirium defense, and it's over on the left. When a person is raving, they're not responsible for their actions. The insanity defense, as most people think of it today, is the person on the right, where a very calm and clear Daniel McNaughton tried to kill the Prime Minister, thinking that the Prime Minister was trying to kill him. He had a delusional belief, but he was not delirious. And the courts wrestled with this. When can we exonerate people who are acting under the influence of a delusional belief? That's what most people think of when they think of the insanity defense today. But it's not the original insanity defense, which is all about being delirious. Let me give you a little bit of data, and then we'll try to wrap things up a little bit. This is some data from before the point where any of the controlled trial data began to come out. This is just the drug research unit down in Southampton looking at a bunch of GPs giving out these drugs when they come on the market first, either Prozac or Seroxat, and reporting. These are GP reports that we've had a bunch of patients who've become aggressive on these drugs. We've even had one that went on to murder. The issue about all of this came out most in 2004 in terms of the SSRI group of antidepressants causing children to become suicidal. At that point in time, the regulators in the States in particular had licensed not just Prozac but Paxil and Zoloft for children also. Ultimately, Paxil and Zoloft didn't come on the market. But these were the data from the Zoloft trials in kids, looking at the children on it becoming aggressive or hostile compared with the kids in the placebo arm from the same trials. But the key event was this, which was GlaxoSmithKline's SSRI, Seroxat, Paxil. This article here was produced by the company in 2001 saying this drug is wonderful and marvelous. You should put it in the drinking water or the Coca-Cola for every child who's anyway nervous. It gets them better and it's tremendously safe. This was written even though 3 years beforehand the company had internally decided that their drug didn't work for children who were anxious or depressed and wasn't safe. New York State got to hear about this, became aware that the company was misrepresenting the data and took a fraud action against GSK to recover the money that had been spent on this drug being given to kids in New York State. As a result of the action, GSK agreed to put their clinical trial data up on the company website. They don't actually do that, but from what did get put up, you can glean this information, which is if you look at the trials that they've done at that point in time and look at the episodes of people becoming hostile on their drug and on placebo, this is what you find. Hostile is a coding term that includes aggression, homicidal ideation, homicidal acts, and homicide. There's a twofold increase in risk of people becoming hostile on Seroxat compared to placebo overall. Among the more interesting groups in there, of course, are the PMDD trials. This is for what's PMT over here. We don't have PMDD. But anyway, they've done some trials over in North America for this. And women, PMDD is a condition that women have got off murder for. Arguing that they've got severe PMDD, they have got off murder charges. But you see that women with PMDD given Paxil were much more likely to become hostile than women with PMDD who weren't being given Paxil. Perhaps the most interesting group are the normals below. This is healthy volunteers who were, again, much more likely to become hostile on the drug than normals just given placebo. And Pfizer, with their drug, Zoloft, had done a healthy volunteer trial in Leeds many years beforehand, 10 years before the drug came on the market. And in this trial of healthy volunteers, women, 6 women had been given Zoloft and 6 given placebo. The trial terminated after a week because all of the women given Zoloft became agitated and anxious on it, and some of them became aggressive on it. This led to the trial being terminated, and Pfizer concluding that their drug had caused this, even though in the public domain later, to this day, they will probably still deny that their drug causes people to become violent. We ran a healthy volunteer trial in North Wales, unaware of the data that you've just seen there, and in our healthy volunteer trial, 2 of the volunteers became suicidal, one of whom also became violent, and this is her, a totally normal, wonderful woman who, under the influence of Zoloft, became violent. Now, how long has this been known? Well, the first antidepressant was released in 1958, and this is a meeting in Cambridge, UK, 1959, where people are convened and they're discussing the effects of an antidepressant called Imipramine, which is also a serotonin reuptake inhibiting drug. And they're saying it's great, it's wonderful, marvelous, it's a drug which cures people who otherwise would have needed ECT. This is a much more potent and effective antidepressant than Prozac. A lot better than Prozac, okay? Nevertheless, some of the people there say, even though they're saying it's great and wonderful, also note that there's a group of people in there who can become more anxious when they take it, and they can become more anxious and become aggressive on this drug, okay? There's people whom this drug doesn't suit, and if it doesn't suit you, you can become suicidal and aggressive, okay? So it was more than one person here. This is the Christmas tree light bulb test, which is much better than controlled trials. When Christmas tree light bulbs used to be the way they were, bulbs which could blow, you'd put the Christmas tree lights away for a year and take them out at the end of the year, put them on the tree and plug them in, and they wouldn't work. So the trick was to go around and unscrew each of the light bulbs until you unscrewed one and all of the lights came on again. You screwed it in again and they went off again. So you took that bulb out and everything was fine. This is much more conclusive data than any controlled trial data is. And this is the kind of data that underpins the evidence that these drugs can make you suicidal and make you homicidal. Here's a key case. We're almost at the last point here, which is this. This is a woman, Yvonne Woodley, a 42-year-old woman, totally normal, no history of nerves. She goes to her doctor because things are breaking up with her husband. She's under stress. Her doctor notes that she's no risk of suicide, nothing like that, that it's just stress. So the doctor puts her on an SSRI antidepressant, and a week later she's worse. She goes back and first hints that she may be thinking about harming herself. The doctor doubles the dose. A few weeks later, she's tried to harm herself. She goes back to the doctor doubles the dose again, and after that she kills herself. Now, the coroner at the inquest asked the experts for the family and the medical representative from the company that makes the drug and the doctors who treated her 2 questions. They're all asked the same 2 questions. Can your drug cause a person to commit suicide? And then, did it cause this lady to commit suicide? And here's the answer from the medical director of the company, who's obliged to say, if caught in the headlights, which they rarely are, and ask, can your drug cause a person to commit suicide? They are legally obliged to say yes. If asked the question which they usually ask, did it cause this woman to commit suicide? they can say no, because, well, we can't be absolutely certain. You know, there could be all sorts of other reasons why not. It's a bit like Matt Miller. It might have been autoerotic asphyxiation gone wrong, because she hung herself in the attic also, and she was almost kneeling. So he said, he also went on to say, look, we've warned about these risks for ages. There's clear warnings on the drug, so if things go wrong, it's the doctor's fault. The doctor was sitting down there in the well of the court listening to all this, and she was asked the same two questions. Can this drug cause people to commit suicide? And did it cause this lady to commit suicide? And she answers, no, it can't cause people to commit suicide, even though she's heard the company medical director say it causes people to commit suicide. And if they commit suicide, it's your fault, the doctor's fault. She still can't bring herself to say that these drugs cause people to commit suicide. The American Psychiatric Association, when the fuss about kids becoming suicidal and these drugs blew up, wrote a suicide note for the entire association by saying, we believe that antidepressants save lives. They should have said, we believe that psychiatrists save lives rather than antidepressants, by knowing that these drugs can be awfully risky and not suited to everyone. Otherwise, if it's the pills that do the trick, we should just let nurses prescribe them and everything will be fine. In all of the school shootings over in the States, pretty well all of them, there's been psychotropic drugs involved, either the antidepressants or mood stabilizers or whatever. And here's a collage that could have been repeated from any of them. It's sort of, you know, the scene, or it's all the photographs of the dead, or it's the doctor. And a recent case in France sort of has upped the ante slightly, where this French psychiatrist was found guilty, or was found responsible for the fact that one of her patients killed someone else. She should have seen the risks. Well, all psychiatrists are in much the same boat these days, because this is an issue that has been known about for 50 years. We cannot say we didn't know about it. There's two other complicating factors. Well, one other complicating factor, which is this. Shane Clancy broke up with his girlfriend in Ireland some years ago, and then decided he made a bad mistake and went back to her again and said, couldn't we get together again? And she said, no, I've moved on, I've got a new boyfriend. And so his mum sent him on a trip around the world. Being Irish, you've got relatives in Australia and the United States and wherever, so you can have a free trip around the world. And even this didn't put him right. So his mum took him to the doctor, who put him on an SSRI. And he tried to kill himself, and the doctor kept the dose of the drug going. And shortly afterwards, Shane went to the house of his girlfriend's new boyfriend and stabbed him to death. Also stabbed the girlfriend, didn't kill her, stabbed the boyfriend's brother, didn't kill him, before going out in the back garden and stabbing himself 23 times and then impaling himself on a bunch of knives. A jury of farmers and shopkeepers in Ireland decided that he was not responsible. This was not suicide. The family on the opposite side, the girlfriend and boyfriend's family, however, have taken the verdict all the way to the Supreme Court in Ireland and are now going to the European Court with it. They cannot accept the idea that Shane Clancy is a victim also. The only victim that they can see is their son rather than the other mother's son. And potentially the doctor is a victim too. But these are issues where just there's a profound problem letting a murderer potentially, a person who may be viewed as a murderer, walk free. In an effort to try and get to grips with these issues, we've created risk.org. This is my conflict of interest statement here, which is a patient adverse event reporting website. What I'd love you guys to do is go in and have a look at it, because one of the things we've got on it is a violence zone, as you see over there. And you can go into this and see about all the drugs that can cause people to become violent or homicidal. It would be great if you could encourage anyone you know who's on any drug, who's any adverse events at all, whether on their hair or the skin or whatever, to go in and report. That would be marvelous. But I want to end with this slide, which is, if you go in and look at the drugs that cause you to commit violence, you find something interesting. On davidhealy.org, I had a post a few weeks ago about the bridge-end sequence of suicides, which is now close to 100. A lot of people of whom have hung themselves, and there's been big questions about what's going on here, because it's strange. The hangings have been strange. It's people who've been found kneeling as they hang themselves, which has led to talk about cults and all sorts of odd things, okay? Looking at what's happening in Bridgend, however, if you want to try and find out what's going on, it's terribly hard, because the coroners don't let anyone know anything about the drugs that people could have been on. In the case of Bridgend, looking at it, in the course of a day or two, I was able to compile a list of 98 drugs that can cause you to commit suicide. It's more than that now. After the post went up, I've been able to think of a bunch more. So it's well over 100 different drugs can cause you to commit suicide, from anti-malarial drugs to antibiotics to anti-itch drugs to a range of other drugs, can all cause you to commit suicide. And if they can cause you to commit suicide, they can cause you to commit homicide or violence also. So this is a huge issue of huge importance to all of us, and we need to raise consciousness about the issues more generally. Thank you.